In the 2010s, public discourse in Europe and the United States entered a new era. In the context of the wave of refugees, pre-existing anti-immigration political forces have been strengthened. There was also an increase in marked anti-immigration sentiment, where some majorities could express concern about the different cultures of immigrants who had become citizens a few generations earlier, and where the arrival of recent immigrants in the hundreds of thousands had made local societies noticeably more diverse than before. Populist political forces, have also created an anti-immigrant public mood in countries where the number and proportion of refugees or economic migrants seeking to settle in the country concerned in incomparable lower than in Western European societies, which are seen as role models by both citizens and political elites of that countries. Governments opposed to the democratic values and rule of law norms of the European Union, such as the Hungarian and Polish ones, were able to rally larger crowds at home behind their anti-immigrant stance than other aspects of real confrontation with the European mainstream. Nobody, Hungary is known as the country that refuses to accept international migrant following more rigid public policies than other European countries. In the census of 2011, only 3.9% of population was born outside the country. 211,000 among them were holding Hungarian citizenship, while 130,000 others were aliens. More than 93% of the population spoke Hungarian as a mother language, and 1.3% declared that their first language is that of one of the traditional minorities. Only 0.5% mentioned a migrant language, while 5.3% refused to answer the question at the last national census. The country has become practically unilingual, which was not during most of its history. Let's see at first the situation before modernity. Indeed, Hungary has been historically a country of cultural melting pot, where the role of immigrants and foreigners served as one of the central questions in the formation of national self-identity in debates between political forces and intellectual groups. In the symbolic historical debates, a part of the Hungarian mobility tried to refer their ancestors who arrived with the Hungarian invaders of the 19th century, in contrast to other group of nobility whose ancestors arrived from West in the 11th century, when the central power, the National Alpha dynasty, needed the help of foreign Christian mobility against the Hungarian tribal aristocracy. Let's see some picture about it. In this picture, you can see That's what's happened from the 18th to the 12th century, when Hungarian invaders arrived in a territory of Central Europe, in which dominantly Slavic people lived before. And in this territory, you can see an absolutely mixed population started to live. It practically shown that in every territories, in almost every territories, Hungarians started to live together in a mixed form with the local Slavic people. In the 13th century, there was the so-called Mongol Invasion. You can see in this picture that the expansion of the Mongol Empire reached the Hungarian border in the 1240s, in the 1240s, and in the rightest picture, you can see that the Mongol invasion destroyed about half of the country absolutely. On the with color pop, you can see the territories which was absolutely destroyed by the Mongol invasion. Here you can see a kind of great reorganization of the country. Here are the greatest town or the most important towns which was organized based on immigrants coming, greatest part of them coming from the West. From the 14th up to the early 20th century, the Hungarian throne was ruled mostly by kings of Anjou, Luxembourg, Jagello, Habsburg families. Some groups of nobility referred to it till the 1940s, contrary to other ones, who referred to the fact that not only the foreign but the native Hungarian Arpad dynasty resorted to a policy of the foreign friend to keep their power over the country. The question of Eastern roots and Western roots became a deep ideological and political debate. In some sense, it was one of the bases of the Hungarian race theory, appearing time and again even in the second half of the 20th century. The Eastern roots is mentioned several times in the late 2010s too, as ideological basis of the friendly foreign policy of the government to autocratic regimes of ex-Soviet Union. The non-noble classes of society, led by bourgeois intellectuals, producing the various versions of a national ideology, registered and kept in their family memory their ethnic differences, as established since the late Middle Age. German settlers of towns, commune groups escaping from Mongols, and so on. They often formed self-governed communities in central part of Carpathian Basin. Armenians arrived from east and Jews arrived from west on the period of the great pogroms of the medieval West. As in many underdeveloped society, the Armenians and Jews got important positions in the money economy, trade, and taxation. The Turkish occupation, let's see a table or a map about it. Well, so it's a picture about to understand the Turkish occupation. That's in this period in the 16th century. That was two world power. One is the Habsburgs once, who belongs to branch of Habsburgs. There is the Spanish Habsburgs. You see the empire in yellow, and there is the Central European Habsburgs. You see their empire red. That is the one side, and the Ottoman Empire, you see it's in orange. It is the other great power of the century. In the here you can see a smaller picture about Europe and how the Hungary got into the border of the Habsburg and Ottoman Empire. So the Turkish occupation covered the overwhelming part of the contemporary territory of Hungary in the 16th, 17th centuries, and it brought new waves of immigrants. Greeks, who similarly to the Phanariots of Balkan, played significant role in the trade of the Turkish Empire. Serbs, who played a similar role in sailing on the Danube. The eastern part of the country, namely Transylvania, now in Romania, was a semi-independent puppet state of the Turkish Empire, much like the Romanian ducats. You see, it's on the on the map left that three puppet territory. Added to the Romanian settlers of medieval times, new Romanian settlers arrived to Transylvania from Romanian ducats in the 17th and 18th century, forming by that time a majority of the Transylvanian population. The western and northern areas of the country, now belonging to Western Central Slovakia, was controlled by the Habsburg Empire, and huge chain of fortresses protected the frontier between Christian Europe and the Turkish Empire. You see there's the map on the right side. The red territory is the original part of the Habsburg Empire, the Austrian or the Central European Habsburgs, and the green part is the territory of the Hungarian Kingdom, of that territory of Hungarian Kingdom which became the part of Habsburg Empire. On the right side, you see the mentioned puppet territories, puppet ducats, and in the central and the greatest part of the country is dominated by the Ottoman Empire itself. You can see it with yellow or in yellow. And on the huge line nearby where the green and yellow territories reach to each other, there are that's line of fortresses. So in these fortresses, large groups of Czech, Austrian, Bavarian, Italian, Spanish soldiers lived, and naturally often mixed via sexual relations with Hungarian peasant girls and women. Their sons and daughters became integrated in the life of villages and towns in these regions. In the next chapter of this lecture, I will speak the migration in Hungary within the Habsburg Empire. A long war at the end of 17th century forced the Ottoman Empire back. The borders were stabilized somewhere in the middle of contemporary Serbia and Romania. In this war, half of the population of the Carpathian Basin disappeared. Let's see a picture what's happened in the Carpathian Basin in that time. Two types of immigrants arrived to fill the majority of the northern, contemporary central and northern Slovakia and eastern territory, contemporary western Romania. That was the two places from where Slovaks and Roman immigrants arrived. There was, nearby this, a strong state policy of the Habsburg Empire to bring in German and Slovakian settlers who would form complete new villages all over the territories recaptured from Ottomans. At the end of 18th century, and especially in the 19th century, huge group of Jews arrived, escaping from the pogroms of Russian-controlled Poland, Galicia. During the Gründerzeit of the period of post-feudal industrialization and modernization, between 1850 and the turn of century, skilled workers and merchants arrived from Bohemia and German Austria. In the late 19th century, Hungary was the most multinational and multi-confessional country of Europe, in the sense that the dominant nation-building ethnic group, the Hungarians, and the dominant religion, the Roman Catholics, represented less than 50% of the population. Let's see a picture about it. That's the map, how the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Doppel monarchy, existed. And in the right side, you can see the ethnical majority of the different territories. And in this special map, you can see the different territories, from which territory, which denomination in majority, which ethnicity in majority, and in which and in what kind of majority. In the dark red place, there are absolute majority of Hungarians. In the light red place, there are only a relative majority of Hungarians. There are similar situations concerning Slovakians. You can see them in dark green and light green. Ukrainians, under names Russians, in the brown territory. There are Romanians with in purple light. There are with orange the German settlements of different parts, especially you see in the most western part of the country and the south part of Transylvania and south part of Transdanubia. And there are in yellow, you can see Serbian groups too. For the denomination pluralism, I brought two maps. One which show the what kind of Christian denominations dominate the different territories. You can see the light red, the Roman Catholic, deep red or dark red, there is the Greek Catholic ones. You can see yellow, the Calvinist population. You can see green, the Lutheran population, and you can see in blue the Greek Orthodox population. In the right part of the map, you can see how the relatively big Jewish community arrived. The greatest part of them arrived from east. You see the most colored place nearby Galicia, nearby the contemporary Ukrainian border, and there are some important places, especially in the towns, where there are a relatively high number of Jews exist. Oh, sorry. In the educated part of the society, belonging to the modern sectors, German Jews, Hungarian Jews, German Catholics, German Lutherans, and Hungarian Lutherans formed the absolute majority. The Hungarian Western Christian gentry and middle class were concentrated in the administration and some traditional sectors of the economy. If we want to describe the social reality of the post-1920s, quasi-contemporary Hungary, in the peripheral two-thirds of the country, Serbian, Romanian, Ukrainian, Slovakian peasant societies made up the majority with Hungarian bureaucrats, German town dwellers, and as local minorities. The role of persons with immigrant ancestors, the foreigners, became one of the key topics of the Hungarian nationalists since the late 19th century. In the long 19th century, several groups of Hungarian citizens emigrated for political and economic reasons. As an element of the international revolutionary situation of 1848, The Hungarian liberal and radical forces tried to create a half-independent, later a fully independent kingdom with a quasi-liberal constitutional regime. In 1849, when the Romanov and Habsburg armies overpowered the troops of the Hungarian Revolution, a significant part of liberal and radical elite emigrated. The soldiers formed the most relevant emigrant groups, since it was a real risk that the professional soldiers of pre-1848 Habsburg army would be severely repressed for their anti-Habsburg military activity. These groups of soldiers appeared in the Italian War of Independence in the late 1850s as professional revolutionaries, just like their Polish colleagues were called by anti-liberal bureaucrats and politicians. In reality, the majority of them were not at all internationalist revolutionaries, but hoped some help of liberal Italy against the Habsburgs. The greatest part of political emigration repatriated after the Austro-Hungarian Compromise, securing for themselves important positions not only in the Hungarian parliament and government, but in the Common Foreign Ministry of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Kossuth, the head of the revolutionary government in 1848-1849, remained in exile, but the emigration had no relevant political role in the 1867-1918 period, and there was no new political reason to emigrate in that time. Mass waves of emigrants left the country at America for economic reasons in the last decades of the dual monarchy, amounting to close to 10% of Hungarian citizens, first of all poor peasants. Some of them formed Hungarian communities overseas. There was even a small town in the United States which was called Budapest by the inhabitants. But the aim of majority was to collect money in the United States, repatriate and purchase farms in the Hungarian countryside. In the next chapter, and that's the map belongs to that, I will speak about after the situation after the First World War. After the First World War, since the Habsburg Empire collapsed, two-thirds of Hungary were allotted to the newly founded or extended neighbor states, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Romania. In the year of 1920s, hundreds of thousands of immigrants arrived from the territories detached who became a stable basis for Hungarian revisionist nationalism. The significant role of Jews in the modernization of Budapest and some bigger cities resulted in an overrepresentation of Jews in the radical French and Italian meaning social democratic and communist movements. So the political ruling groups, clerical and proto-Nazi groups, used the anti-Semitic nationalist ideology against them. In the 1930s, the assimilation of German peasantry was stopped, and an ethnic renaissance movement started among them. In the period of 1920s, the number of Germans lost only 0.5%. In the in the period of the 1920s, the number of Germans lost 14% of themselves, but in the 30s only 0.5% of them. The Volksbund movement formed a coalition with the Third Reich, so over 200,000 Germans were expelled in 1946 as a form of unselective collective retaliation, impossible to be justified by legal arguments. In this map, you can see the political borders of Central Europe, and in this map on the left side there are the main types of political systems. In brown you can see the autocratic type regimes. Polish Catholics and Polish Jews, mainly members of the Polish army, arrived in 1939 as refugees. Hungarian troops, in alliance with Nazi Germany, occupied in 1940 to 1944 South Slovakia, North Serbia, and Northwest Romania. You can see it on the right side of the map, generating significant ethnic conflicts in these territories. Thus, after the war, not only the Hungarian invaders, but sometimes the Hungarian population who had lived over centuries in the towns and villages of Slovakia were forced to escape to Hungary in 1945. Since a wide range of groups of the Hungarian population supported the anti-Jewish policies, together with large sectors of Catholic Germans of Hungary, Schwaben, the latter were really overrepresented among the supporters of Hitler-allied puppet government in 1944. The right and left-wing forces after 1945 agreed to let the anti-German settlements of the population develop freely during the change of regime after 1945. In the post-First World War decades, contrary to the pre-First World War ones, several reasons generated politically motivated emigration. With the permission of the Entente powers, afraid from the Hungarian revolutions as a potential agents of Russian Bolsheviks in 1918-1919, militarist and proto-fascist groups in coalition with conservative aristocrats and anti-Semitic Christian middle-class elements get to the power in the autumn of 1919. A big wave of communist, socialist, and radical liberal emigration emerged in the 1920s, contributing later vastly to the animation of intellectual and cultural life of Vienna, Berlin, Frankfurt, and Hollywood and Los Alamos. The next wave of emigration concerned young Jewish students and intellectuals under the numerus clausus in 1920s and later, after 1938, under the anti-Jewish laws, but the greatest part of the Hungarian Jews hoped that the Hungarian government will maintain a balance between the Nazi influence and the constitutional tradition. Given the rarity of receiving countries, all this meant that there was no big wave of Jewish immigration in 1938. In 1944, several 100,000 Hungarians moved to the west, fleeing the Red Army or forced by administrative orders. The puppet government indeed urged the migration of public officers and the members of the armed units to leave the country with retreating Wehrmacht. Because of this emigration wave, right-wing Hungarian political emigrant settlers in masses in Canada, Argentina, and Australia, as well as Western Germany. The deportation managed in 1944 destroyed the majority of the countryside Jews. A part of the Auschwitz survivors and smaller Zionist groups of Budapest settled in Israel. The liberals, conservatives, and socialists, after a short democratic period of 1945-47, were also forced to emigration, facing growing difficulties to cross the border westwards, mined by the communist power in the 1949-1956 period. The Stalinist dictatorship offered an intensive motivation for emigration, but the technical possibility of the crossing Iron Curtain was limited. In November and December of 1956, since the autocratic communist regime was reconstructed after the revolution of 1956 with Soviet troops, some 200,000 refugees, mainly younger ones, left for the West. They consisted of conservative and right-wing groups as well as significant socialist and left-wing groups, which succeed to form informal study circles and think tanks with editorial boards of the Hungarian press in emigration in London, Paris, and New York. After the consolidation of the Kadar regime, the post-56 regime, in the late 1960s and 1970s, this emigration started to build bridges in Hungary, and several members of repatriated after the fall of communist regime in the 1990s. In the 1960s, the liberalization, the quasi-liberalization of Kadar regime started to tolerate the academic, business, family, and touristic relations with the Western world. So several thousand socially and economically motivated migrants left for the West. Principally, illegal emigration was a crime, so such dissidents were not allowed to return into the country in the next 5 years, but, especially after the Helsinki Agreement, communist policies softened in this field. Let's see now the immigration in the communist period. In the period of communism, some smaller group of immigrants arrived. Political immigrants in the 1950s from Greece, later refugees from Pinochet-ruled Chile, as well as a number of third-world students due to political agreements with Syria, Libya, Nasser-type Egypt, Socialist Yemen, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, North Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Mixing with them was not supported, but it was tolerated by the communist government. Some of them married with Hungarians and got settled for good. In the years of Korean War, Hungary helped North Korea, educated Korean orphans in Hungary. But in 1957, the North Koreans ordered back their children, so there is no Korean community in Hungary. There has not been Jewish and Gypsy immigration, but the role of Jews and Gypsies, and more specifically the anti-Jewish and anti-Gypsy sentiment, belong to our topic. Since the accidental reasons, the deportation of Jews in 1944 started at the countryside, and the authorities ran out of time to deport the Jews of Budapest, a new cleavage made the conflict of the Christian middle class and Jewish middle class deeper. The natural competition of the countryside intellectuals and intellectuals of Budapest appeared tacitly as a Christian-Jewish, Hungarian-Jewish opposition. This topic was not openly discussed in the communist times, but later, after 1989, the pluralist political arena led the formation of parties along such principles, giving birth to the Christian middle-class dominated political party, the so-called Hungarian Democratic Forum, and the secular Jewish middle-class dominated Free Democrat Union. As the two strongest party of the 1990-1994 first post-communist parliament. This was in clear contrast to other East European states, where the post-communist, non-communist cleavage was the dominant. Gypsies lived in Hungary since the Turkish period, but lived in segregated in peripheral territories of smaller villages. In the communist period, since the disappearance of traditional gypsy industries, the expansion of socialist steel industry and mining, the bureaucratic obstacles to the traveler lifestyle brought huge groups of gypsies into bigger towns. So there was no real gypsy immigration into the country, but millions of Hungarians met masses of gypsies for the first time in cities and started to regard them as new Hungarians, with hostile attitudes similar to those they directed against foreigners. In the modernization process, the number of children of the non-gypsy Hungarian villagers declined, so the relative proportion of children of gypsies grew in the rural population as well. The Hungarian law, following the consensus of Versailles Pact, was not in favor of the immigration of ethnic Hungarians from neighboring countries, but in the late 1980s, the Romanian communist dictatorship generated deep ethnic conflict, and the Hungarian ethnic party state became more tolerant in this respect. As a result, a number of ethnic Hungarian migrants arrived from starvation-ridden Romania. The real specificity of Hungarian history is that objectively, the Hungarian society has always been a heavily multi-denominational one. Since different political forces generally use the word foreigner or alien as a synonym of enemy, several social conflicts appeared to be ethical ones. Sometimes many historically recent incomers, compensating for their recent assimilation, behaved as hardcore populist nationalists and ethnicists against the newer comers. Let's see now the post-1990 period. The first big mass migrant groups of the post-communist period arrived because of the collapse of Yugoslavia and the ethnic policy of Serbia. In the 1990s, non-Serbian refugees arrived, but the greatest part of them moved to West, without any social conflict in Hungary. None of the political forces was interested in exploiting them for propaganda purposes. The war in Yugoslavia has not affected ethnic Hungarians in mass, but many ethnic Hungarian youngsters wanted to avoid military service and risk their life in the civil war and international conflicts of Milosevic-led Serbia. A kind of political immigration of these youngsters, sometimes together with other members of their family, appeared especially in the southern towns of Hungary. The greatest part of them repatriated to Serbia after the war. The management of the crisis was successful because there was no political force to exploit the situation. Similarly to any other European societies, Chinese economic immigrants arrived to Hungary in the 1990s, building up a network of shops of non-expensive Chinese products. In the period of modern new migrant crisis of 2015, the Orban government provoked a political hysteria, a kind of moral panic around the immigrant masses from the Near East, applying a large range of mostly false arguments against them. Let's see the arguments. To feed and care for migrants is too expensive for the Hungarian taxpayers. Second, the migrants mean an epidemical risk. The foreigner is a biological danger. Third, the migrants mean a problematic factor in the everyday life. They are far too visible on the streets and railway stations, buses, and so on. Fourth, the migrants represent a legal problem, appear as people who don't ask a permission for what they do, who demonstrate the break of public order. The next one. The migrants pose a cultural risk. The government stresses more and more intensive the Christian face of Hungarian culture, while, on contrary, Hungarians are one of the most secular societies in Europe. The next one. The migrants pose a criminological risk with regard to their inclination to rape and sexual harassment. The next one. The migrants are a national, quasi-military danger due to the presence of terrorists among them. The next one. The migrants symbolize the danger of the loss of Hungarian independence. Since the policy of Brussels is responsible for the crisis, and Brussels tries to impose its will to Hungary. Because of very intensive anti-immigrant propaganda campaign, the great majority of the population supports these non-tolerant policies, objectified by the building of a physical wall in the southern border of the country and refusal by the government of any migrants quota. In reality, even several population clusters who vote for the democratic opposition of the ruling Fidesz party are influenced by that government propaganda in this question. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention.